The dinner invitation came on a Tuesday, which should have been my first warning. My daughter called me that afternoon, her voice carrying that particular brightness she uses when she's trying too hard. She said her in-laws were hosting a small gathering at their home in Scottsdale. Nothing formal, just family. She wanted me there. I told her I'd think about it. I already knew what it was going to be. I'd been to enough of those dinners in the 3 years since she married their son to understand the choreography. The good china would come out. Lynette, my daughter, would sit beside her husband and smile too much. Her mother-in-law would ask about my retirement in that tone people use when they mean something else entirely. And her father-in-law, a man named Harrington, Victor Harrington, would look at me the way men like him always look at men they've decided are beneath them. Patient, almost amused. Like a cat that hasn't yet decided whether to play with the mouse. I went anyway. I put on the same navy sport coat I'd worn to Lynette's college graduation. I drove my 2009 Camry, the one with the dent above the rear wheel well that I'd been meaning to fix for 6 years. I parked it next to a row of vehicles that probably cost more collectively than the house I'd raised my daughter in. The Harrington home was one of those sprawling Scottsdale estates that looks like it was designed primarily to make other people feel small. 12-foot ceilings, travertine floors, art on the walls that nobody actually looked at. Their housekeeper, a quiet woman who I always made a point of greeting by name, led me through the foyer to the back patio where the family had already gathered around a table set with flowers I couldn't name and glasses that caught the early evening light. Victor stood when I walked out. He was the kind of man who knew how to make standing up look like a performance. 6'2", silver-haired, the kind of tan you only get when you can afford to winter somewhere. He shook my hand firmly, the way men do when they want you to understand something without saying it. "Wallace," he said, "good of you to make it." His wife Cordelia smiled from across the table. She was impeccably dressed, as always, and her smile was the kind that reaches the eyes without actually coming from them. Their son, my son-in-law, Lynette's husband, a man named Bryce, was standing by the outdoor bar. He raised his glass in my direction. He wasn't a bad person, Bryce. He just wasn't strong enough to push back against the current his family created. I'd made peace with that early on. Lynette came to me and kissed my cheek. She whispered, "Thank you for coming, Dad." The way she said it made me wonder what she knew or suspected about the evening ahead. We sat down to eat. The conversation started the way it always did. Local politics, the Arizona housing market, a charity gala the Harringtons had chaired the previous spring. Victor asked about the Suns. I said I hadn't followed basketball closely in years. He nodded like I'd confirmed something. Then, somewhere between the salad and the main course, Cordelia set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Careful, almost sympathetic. "Wallace," she said, "we've been wanting to talk to you about something as a family." I picked up my water glass. "All right." Victor leaned back in his chair. "We think the world of Lynette, you know that. She's been wonderful for Bryce, truly." I waited. "But we've been concerned," Cordelia said, "about stability, about the future. Bryce has certain ambitions, certain opportunities ahead of him, and we want to make sure that Lynette, that both of them, are positioned well." I looked at my daughter. Her eyes were fixed on the table in front of her. "I'm not sure I follow," I said, though I followed perfectly. Victor reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. He set it on the table between us. Not sliding it, deliberate, like a chess piece. "We'd like to help," he said. "We'd like to provide for Lynette in a way that gives her real security. A trust in her name fully funded. $2 million to start. And we'd like to begin the process of formally integrating her into the Harrington family estate planning." I looked at the envelope. "What's in there?" I asked. "A proposal," Victor said. "Our attorney drafted it. It lays out everything cleanly. The trust structure, the terms," I repeated. Victor met my eyes. "The terms include a request. We're asking that you step back from your involvement in Lynette and Bryce's day-to-day life. Not disappear, of course not. But at a distance, Wallace. A comfortable distance. For everyone." The patio was quiet for a moment. I could hear the water feature in their garden. The kind of silence that has weight to it. I didn't pick up the envelope. I looked at my daughter instead. She still wasn't looking at me. Her hands were in her lap. Her husband was staring at his plate. "Lynette," I said quietly. She finally looked up. Her eyes were wet. "I told them I didn't want them to do this," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "But here we are," I said. "Here we are," she said. I nodded once. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. I looked at Victor Harrington, who was watching me with that patient, calibrated expression. The expression of a man who had made deals his entire career and never lost one he cared about. "I appreciate the thought you put into this," I said. "I'll need some time to consider it." Victor nodded, generous in victory. Of course, take all the time you need. I drove home through the Scottsdale evening, past the palm trees and the lit-up storefronts and the restaurants full of people having ordinary nights. I drove with both hands on the wheel, the way my father taught me. I didn't turn on the radio. Let me back up. I should explain some things. My name is Wallace Pruett. I am 64 years old. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house with 4 children and 1 bathroom, and a father who worked 31 years at the same machine shop. My mother taught 2nd grade. We were not poor exactly, but we were careful. I watched my father be careful his entire life, and I watched what it did to him, and I made a decision when I was about 22 that I would figure out a different way. I was not naturally brilliant. I was not a prodigy. What I was stubborn and observant, and willing to do the kind of slow, boring, invisible work that most people aren't interested in. I read everything I could find about capital markets. I took a job at a regional brokerage in Columbus, straight out of Ohio State, making $31,000 a year, and I saved 40% of everything I earned, every month, for years. Not because I was ascetic or strange, but because I understood at a cellular level that patience was the only real advantage available to someone who started with nothing. I bought my first commercial real estate position at 31. A small industrial property outside of Columbus. Unglamorous. Completely unglamorous. The kind of thing no one writes magazine articles about. But it cash flowed, and I bought another, and then another, and I began doing the same thing in markets no one was looking at yet. Albuquerque. Tucson. The outer rings of Phoenix back when they were still considered the outer rings. By the time I was 45, I had accumulated a portfolio that was significant by any reasonable definition. By the time I was 50, it was something else. I did not talk about it. Partly this was temperament. I had no interest in the things that money is supposed to make you want. The boats, the watches, the restaurants where you need a reservation 3 months out. I liked my house. I liked my car. I liked the fact that I could disappear in a room full of people and no one would look twice. But there was a practical reason too. I had learned over decades in real estate and private markets that visible wealth attracts a specific kind of attention. The lawsuits, the solicitations, the people who recalibrate their behavior toward you the moment they understand what you're worth. I had seen it happen to partners, colleagues, friends. I had decided early that I preferred people to see me as I was before the money because that was the version of me I trusted. My wife, Lynette's mother, died when Lynette was 17, breast cancer, 2 years from diagnosis to the end. Her name was Gloria, and I will not write about her in detail here because some things are not for other people's consumption. What I will say is that after she died, the money meant even less than it had before, and the only thing I cared about was the girl I was raising alone in a house in North Phoenix that was modest on purpose. I was deliberate about that. The modest house, the old car, the way I talked about money, which was rarely and carefully. I wanted Lynette to understand that the world was full of people who would be kind to you because of what you had, and that this kind of kindness was the most dangerous kind. I think I may have overdone it. She grew up thinking we were comfortable but unremarkable. She grew up not knowing that when she got her scholarship to Arizona State, I could have written a check for the full tuition without thinking twice. She grew up not knowing that the reason I never seemed anxious about money was because I had solved that problem a very long time ago. When she married Bryce Harrington 3 years ago, I watched the Harrington family look at me and calculate my value and find it wanting. I watched Victor Harrington introduce me to his colleagues as his son's wife's father, with a pause before my name that said everything. I watched Cordelia ask Lynette in front of me whether she'd thought about what kind of financial stability she was building for her future. I did not correct any of it. I had my reasons. The week after the dinner on the patio, I had lunch with a man named Gerald Foss. Gerald was my attorney, had been for over 20 years. He was originally from Arkansas, which he'd mostly but not entirely lost from his accent. He ordered the same thing every time we ate together, a Reuben sandwich and a cup of black coffee, no matter what kind of restaurant we were in. I told him about the dinner. I told him about the envelope. He listened the way he always listened, which was completely. When I finished, he picked up his coffee, put it back down without drinking from it, and said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to understand something first," I said. "What's the current position of Harrington Capital Group on the public markets?" Gerald looked at me steadily. I said. As of this morning, he knew what I was asking. He said, "I'll have to make a call." "Make the call," I said. Victor Harrington's company, Harrington Capital Group, a Phoenix-based commercial development firm, had gone public 4 years ago. It traded on the NASDAQ. In the 2 years prior to going public, when the company was still private and actively seeking institutional investors for the IPO, It had accepted a significant block of private equity funding from a series of investment vehicles. One of those vehicles, a Delaware-registered LLC called Mesa Holdings, had taken a position representing approximately 18% of what would become the company's outstanding shares. Mesa Holdings was mine. I had been aware of Victor Harrington's company for years before his daughter married my son. Before Bryce came anywhere near Lynette. I had invested in it because the fundamentals were solid and the Phoenix commercial real estate market was doing exactly what I had predicted it would do. It was at the time a purely financial decision. Then Lynette brought Bryce home for Thanksgiving and I understood almost immediately who his family was, and I sat with that information for a long time before deciding what to do with it. I decided to do nothing with it. Not yet. Gerald made his call. He called back that afternoon while I was sitting on my back porch, watching the sun go down over the Sonoran Desert, which I do when I need to think. He said, 18.3% of outstanding shares, Wallace. At today's closing price, that position is valued at approximately $640 million. I said, thank you, Gerald. He said, are you going to do what I think you're going to do? I said, probably. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you should talk to her first, your daughter, before anything else. He was right about that. Gerald was usually right about the things that mattered. I called Lynette the next morning and asked if she'd meet me for coffee, just the two of us. She agreed without hesitation. We met at a place we'd been going since she was in high school, a small independent coffee shop near Camelback that had somehow survived 20 years of chain expansion by being genuinely better than the alternative. The owner knew our names. We always sat in the same corner booth. Lynette was already there when I arrived. She had her mother's eyes, which still catches me off guard sometimes, even after all these years. I sat down across from her and ordered my coffee, and we talked about ordinary things for a few minutes. Her work, she was a landscape architect and she was good at it. A project she was doing for a client in Sedona. Her husband's new office at the Harrington Capitol building downtown. Then she said, are you going to tell me what you're thinking, Dad, about the dinner? I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. I said, I'm going to tell you something and I need you to listen to all of it before you react. She nodded. Her expression was careful, the same expression her mother used to wear when she knew something significant was coming. I told her, not everything, not all the numbers, not all the years, but enough. I told her that the life I had lived, the house, the car, the careful quietness about money, was a choice, not a circumstance. I told her that I had solved the money problem a long time ago and had deliberately solved the appearance of it. I told her about Mesa Holdings. I told her what it meant. She sat across from me and did not speak for a long time. When she did speak, the first thing she said was, did Mom know? I said, your mother and I didn't keep things from each other. She was quiet again. Why didn't you tell me? She said. This was the question I had been sitting with for a long time. I said, because I wanted you to be the person you became without it. I wanted you to build your life the way I built mine, by understanding what things were worth before you understood what things cost. She looked at me for a moment, then she said quietly, that wasn't your decision to make. I said no, probably not. She didn't cry, which I appreciated. She was her mother's daughter in that way too. She felt things deeply and processed them privately. She said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to handle it, but I needed you to know first, and I needed to know if you wanted me to let it go. If you wanted me to just take a step back the way they're asking. I would do that, Lynette, for you, if that's what you needed. She looked out the window at the parking lot for a long moment. Then she said, they tried to buy you off, Dad. They tried to pay you to disappear from my life. She turned back to me. Don't you dare let that go. The Harrington Capital Group held its quarterly board meeting on the third Thursday of each month at their offices in a glass tower downtown that Victor had commissioned himself. I knew the building well. I had never attended a board meeting. That changed on a Thursday in late February. I told Gerald to inform the board secretary that Mesa Holdings would be exercising its right to board representation, which had been part of the original investment agreement and had simply never been invoked. I told him to make sure Victor Harrington was informed of this in writing through proper channels with adequate notice. Gerald sent the letter. Victor called me that same afternoon. He was composed, which I had expected. Men like Victor Harrington do not rattle easily, but there was something underneath the composure, a kind of recalibration happening in real time. Wallace, he said. I received Gerald Foss's correspondence. Good, I said. I have to say, I'm a little surprised. We've never really spoken about. I wasn't aware you had an interest in the company. No, I said. You weren't. A pause. This is a significant position you're describing. It is, I said. "Can I ask what your intentions are?" I said. "I intend to attend board meetings and participate in governance decisions. That's what the investment agreement specifies." Another pause. Longer this time. "I see," he said. "I think we should meet, in person, before the board meeting." "I think that's a good idea," I said. We met at his office the following Tuesday. The office was exactly what you'd expect. Corner suite, floor-to-ceiling glass, the Phoenix skyline arranged behind him like a prop. His desk was large enough to land a small aircraft on. He stood to shake my hand. This time the handshake was different. He was still composed, still controlled, but there was something careful in his grip that hadn't been there before. We sat down. He said, "I want to be straightforward with you, Wallace." I said, "Please." He said, "I had no idea about Mesa Holdings, about your connection to the company. If I had known." He stopped, started again. "If I had understood your position, the conversation at dinner would have gone very differently." "Yes," I said, "I know." He looked at me steadily. We weren't trying to insult you." I said. "What were you trying to do, Victor?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We were trying to structure things for Bryce, for their future, we thought." He paused. "We made assumptions about where you stood, about what your priorities were." I said, "You assumed I was a man without resources and you offered to buy my distance from my daughter's life." He didn't deny it. I said, "I'm going to tell you something, not as a business partner, as Lynette's father." I leaned forward slightly. "She is the best thing I have ever done. Everything I built, everything I managed and accumulated over 40 years, none of it comes close to her. And she married your son because she loves him, not because she needed anything from your family. That's important. I need you to understand that, because it's going to inform every conversation we have going forward." Victor Harrington was quiet. Then he said, "What does going forward look like?" I said, "That depends on you and on Cordelia. And honestly on Bryce." I looked at him. "The investment position isn't going anywhere. I'm not a vindictive man and your company's fundamentals are good. But I am going to be present, in the boardroom, in my daughter's life, and I am going to need the treatment of my family, of Lynette specifically, to change. Not because I'm holding anything over you, but because it's the right way to conduct yourselves." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside his windows, a cloud moved across the Phoenix sky and the light in the room shifted. "You could have told us," he said finally. "At any point, you could have made this much simpler." "Yes," I said. "I could have. Why didn't you?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "I wanted to know who you were," I said, "before you knew who I was." He didn't have anything to say to that. I attended. I wore the same navy sport coat. I drove the Camry. The other board members were exactly what you'd expect. Phoenix development money, a few Phoenix to Dallas types, one retired federal judge who served as the independent director. They were professional. They were measured. Several of them introduced themselves with a warmth that told me Gerald's letter had been passed around and discussed. Victor chaired the meeting. He was professional. Entirely professional. Whatever he was feeling, he had put it somewhere and closed the drawer. At one point in a discussion about the company's expansion into the Las Vegas market, I asked 2 questions, specific questions about projected cap rates and debt service coverage ratios. The kind of questions that demonstrated without announcement or performance that the person asking them had spent a great deal of time in this industry. The room shifted, not dramatically, not with gasps or pointed looks, just a subtle reorientation, the kind that happens when people quietly revise their mental model of who they're dealing with. Victor glanced at me once during that exchange. Just once. Cordelia called me the following week. I'll give her credit for that. It would have been easier, I think, to let things settle into a new and awkward arrangement without direct conversation. The fact that she called told me something about her I hadn't known before. She said, "I owe you an apology, Wallace." I said, "You don't have to." "I do," she said. "What we did at that dinner was wrong. It was condescending and it was wrong, and I've been sitting with that all week." She paused. "I've been sitting with something else, too, that you raised Lynette by yourself after your wife died, and she is." Another pause. "She is remarkable. She genuinely is. I think I knew that, and I still managed to treat you the way I did." I was quiet for a moment. "Cordelia," I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "I'd like to have you over for dinner again if you'd be willing, something smaller. Just the 6 of us." I said, "I'd like that." The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 11 days before I opened it. I already knew what was inside, but I opened it eventually, mostly out of a kind of professional curiosity. The trust structure was actually well designed. Victor's attorney was good. The terms were what I'd expected. Generous on the money side, precise on the conditions. Step back, maintain a comfortable distance. Allow the Harrington family to be the primary structure around Bryce and Lynette's future. I folded it neatly and put it in the recycling bin. It is a strange thing to have spent decades building something invisible and then to let it become visible. There is a loss in it that I hadn't anticipated. The disappearing act was something I had come to value, the ability to move through rooms and situations without the weight of people's assumptions about what I was worth. That is mostly gone now, at least within that particular circle. Bryce came to see me about a month after the board meeting. He came alone without calling ahead, which I respected. He rang my doorbell on a Saturday morning and stood on my front step looking like a man who had been working up to something for a while. I let him in. I made coffee. He sat at my kitchen table and wrapped his hands around his mug the same way I always do, and I thought about what it means to watch the people your children choose and try to understand them fairly. He said, "I need to tell you that I didn't know. About the plan, about what they were going to say at that dinner." He looked up at me. "Lynette told me she believes me. I need to know if you do." I looked at him for a moment. "I believe you," I said. "You're not the problem, Bryce." He exhaled. He said, "I don't want you to think that I married Lynette because of— I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's partly why I never told anyone." We sat for a while in the easy quiet of two people who are figuring out slowly how to be family. There is a moment I keep coming back to. It was at that first dinner before the envelope appeared. Victor had been asking me about my work, what I had done, what I was doing now, how I was keeping myself busy. The careful condescension of a man who had already decided the answer before he asked the question. And I had answered honestly. I said I managed some real estate interests, that I had been retired for several years, that I spent a lot of time reading and working on the house. He had nodded. He said, "That sounds like a good quiet life." And I said, "It is, because it was. It genuinely was." The money did not change the life I had built, which was the point. The life I had built was the point. The greatest revenge, someone once told me, is not to let them see it coming. But I have thought about that, and I'm not sure it's quite right. I don't think what I wanted was revenge. I think what I wanted was to know whether the people my daughter had married into were worth the knowing. Whether there was something real underneath the crystal and the chandelier and the travertine floor. There was. It took some pressure to find it. But it was there. Lynette had coffee with her mother-in-law last week, just the two of them. She texted me afterward. 2 words, "It's better." 2 words from my daughter, who has her mother's eyes and her mother's way of saying exactly what she means. That was enough. That was more than enough.